Sí,
Okay. Okay. Good. As I said before, we are starting a webinar regarding the situation of Israel-Palestine conflict from a feminist perspective, a peace perspective. And before we start the webinar, I would like to present myself and the organization that is behind this webinar. My name is Edme Dominguez, and I represent Gadip, Gender and Development in Practice here in Sweden. And we are an organization trying to put together the efforts from academics and activists regarding feminism, giving attention to several issues regarding women issues, feminist issues in the world. So we are you could call an association, organization with no profits. And we are not funded by anybody special, but we are part of a European network, White Plus, where we participate in several projects. So, so we are mostly, I mean, we are not doing this as a staff or as a job. We are volunteers, you could say, and mostly activists, even if we are also academics. And as I said before, we have organized several webinars on different issues in the world. But this is the first time we organize something on the Middle East. And I should tell you that it has been very difficult to find the right persons to do this, because we know this is a very infected situation, polarized and difficult to handle. So before I start the content of this webinar, I just want to cover some of the rules of participation in the sense of the audience, the public that are coming in. And I hope that everybody can have comments and questions, which can be put either in the chat or in the part of questions and answers. But we really hope that everybody respects the rules, having correct comments and to try to avoid any kind of misunderstandings, aggressions, etc. So we are going to be very firm on that. And so you are welcome to do these comments and to questions and to post your questions. But as I said before, they have to follow certain rules. And also, we are going to devote the last half an hour of the webinar to answer and discuss these questions and comments. And then with that said, we are, as you are aware, taking a theme which is extremely controversial. This, I could say, a long time conflict, several decades conflict between Israel and Palestine. And a conflict that we have known since we were children, I can say, in which there has been no real solutions, and that has become much worse with what happened on October 7th, and what in the reaction to that, which is the terrible situation that is being experienced in Gaza, as I said before, and which is becoming more and more polarized, given that the conflict is extending to Lebanon, and we don't know if it's going to grow even farther on into a big war in the Middle East. So, having given this introduction, I would like to present our panelists. And so we have invited two specialists in this area who are feminists and also working for peace and have been doing so for a long time. Dr. Elana Sztokman is a Jewish Israeli American anthropologist and award-winning author. She was born and bred in the Orthodox Zionist community of Brooklyn, New York, and she has been living in Israel for 30 years, where she has become a vocal peace activist, educator, and writer. And I'm going to put several of the links she has sent to me in the chat. And then Eva Dalak, who is a distinguished international consultant with over 25 years of expertise in international development, gender mainstreaming, conflict prevention, and peace building. She's also founder of Peace Activation to support those affected by the Israel-Palestine conflict, fostering an environment for healing and proactive peace building. She's also a co-founder of One Whole Peace to unite diverse groups in Israel through conflict transformation workshops. She speaks several languages, at least fluent in 5 languages, and she is a multi-stakeholder. She presents a multi-stakeholder facilitation and complex analysis in conflict scenarios. And she's a Palestinian living in Israel as well, but also in Costa Rica. She's going to present herself. And that said, I'm going to start with the questions which we prepare for the panelists.
We left out the most important thing, which is that
Yes,
Eva and I are Eva and I are co-hosts of a podcast called Women Ending War. And so we've been working together.
Yes.
That's okay. No, that's the most important thing that we're doing together, which is that we're trying to collaborate on highlighting voices of women who are working really hard to end the violence and end the conflict. So that's how we're partners. That's how we came to be here together. So I just want
to.
Yeah.
No, yes, you are right to complete that.
Yeah.
And now we start with the questions to the panelists. And the first question that we formulated was, can you tell us something about your organizations? How have you worked for peace initiatives, which is what you have just mentioned? And what are some of the challenges you face as activists in the area? So I give the word to Elana and then to Eva, please.
Oh. Okay. So first of all, hi. Thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to be here and to meet all of you, and kudos to you on doing this work and also on highlighting women's voices around the world and bringing peace. So for us right now, as I just said, the most important work that we're doing, one of the most important things that I feel like we're doing is our podcast, Women Ending War. And through that, we've been building bridges, and we've been highlighting voices, and we've been reaching places and going places and trying to create a different language for the conflict, for each of us in our own way, and each of us through each other, and trying to create a space where we're able to hear each other and be present with each other. Eva always talks about peace activation starting within, that peace starts from within each of us, that we each have to learn first to make peace within ourselves and then to expand it outward. And one of the things actually that I learned so much from Eva has to do with finding that in ourselves and being present for the other person and holding space for the other, because we're trying to recreate this whole idea of being at war and being in conflict and trying to replace all that language of conflict with a language of shared humanity and shared spaces and shared society. We're trying to recreate so many of the concepts that have been deeply ingrained in many of us from our upbringing, especially those of us who have lived this conflict. We're trying to replace that language of conflict and enemy with something else. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of connection. It takes a lot of listening, a lot of empathy. And I'm really enjoying the work with Eva. She teaches me so much, and it's such a good practice. Our work together is itself the practice in peacemaking. So, and there are a whole bunch of other things that we're both involved with. Eva will tell you what she's involved with. I'm also involved with a group called the 1325 Forum, which I'll send the link afterwards. The 1325 Forum is a group of diverse women, Israeli-Palestinian women, who come together with the purpose of bringing peace via bringing more women into positions of decision making. It's based on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 about women, peace, and security, which calls for women around the table in all matters of decision making. And it's not a coincidence that this seemingly endless conflict has almost no women in decision-making power. All these negotiations, even a year of negotiations, have had zero women around the table. Even all of these mothers, tons of mothers who are affected, mothers of hostages, for example. One of the hostage mothers was saying that, how can it be that all of these negotiations about ceasefire, about hostages, there isn't a single mother around the table. There isn't a single woman around the table. I say women also because our value is not just in that we're mothers. Our value is, first of all, that we're human beings with perspectives. We have possibly different perspectives on issues like what security means and what personal security means, which are also not represented by our leaders. So Forum 1325, which started after this war, this round of the war began, brings together women to try to bring those new definitions of security, women's perspectives, diverse women's perspectives into the dialogue, into the discourse, and to advance women's leadership. So those are some of the things that we're involved in. I also do a lot of writing. I do a lot of writing about this. I have a Substack called The Roar, where I try to also highlight. I'm an anthropologist by training, so my tools are writing and analysis of society. So, and now Eva will tell you about her work.
Thank you, Ilana.
Please,
Thank you,
Eva.
Ismail. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the space and for organizing this. It's an honor to be here. I want to mention a couple of important elements that were failed to mention. I'm Muslim. I grew up in Jaffa. That's where I'm calling from right now. And I think the reason why I say that is that it's really important to understand that the context within which we grow up and the context within which we work as feminists, as women, especially in this specific conflict, is very, very important. And our background and upbringing. I launched Peace Activation. It's my organization that I launched in October 2023 when the event happened. I left Israel at the age of 19, like 30 years ago. And I came back this last year focusing all my work and effort and experience and expertise specifically on this seemingly complicated conflict. I say seemingly because I don't consider it complicated. I consider it very simple, straightforward conflict that we've been enjoying complicating it so that we don't acknowledge that there's actually a solution at hand that we don't want to apply. In terms of the work that we do, and specifically in terms of the polarization and the choosing of the sides, who's right, who's wrong, my organization, Peace Activation, is specifically designed to create a field beyond right doing and wrongdoing. It's the field of Rumi, where we can meet and we can find common ground to work together towards a specific goal. And I think Forum 1325, that's how I met Ilana, is a forum that brings together a diversity of women towards a specific agenda. Because women have been manipulated into political agenda that have nothing to do with our own interest and needs. And having worked with the United Nations for the past 25 years, specifically on women, peace and security, whether in New York with DPKO or with the UN in Ivory Coast or in Mombasa and different places, what I noticed is bringing women to the table or bringing women's issue to the table are not enough. We need to do more. We, not only women, we as women and men that have our own interest in raising consciousness around the feminist agenda. And this specifically means that once women are at the table, they are capable to speak up and to have their own agenda presented and that they are heard. Very often we fight for peace and it's not really possible to fight for peace. We need to activate. That's why the word activation is very important for me. We need to activate peace. And the same for the feminist agenda. Once we are at the table, we need to speak. Once we speak, we need to be heard. Once we are heard, we need to have it implemented. When it's implemented, we need to see to hold people accountable to what they say or they act. And I think in the last 24 years of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, since Security Council Resolution 1325, it's incredible that we haven't advanced much. We have made small steps towards increasing the number of women in specific spaces, but we haven't really achieved what we are aiming to achieve, specifically with this resolution. We had a huge number of more resolution taken, but less action actually implemented or people held accountable to really guide us towards what the resolution aimed to have. So that's kind of in a nutshell how Ilana and I came together and why we are really adamant about bringing voices from the field, Israeli and Palestinian women that are working together. Not necessarily that they are agreeing on everything. Ilana and I are not agreeing necessarily on everything, but we have space to share our diversity of experience and background. And that's the beauty of the field. The field is about accepting that we are all radically different. And in this radical difference, we can make a difference. And it's not complicated. I'll stop here and leave you with more questions.
Thank you very much, Eva. Yes, I think this is very interesting, all what you are telling us. And I would like to continue with these questions, and we can complete the information you give us on the process of your presentations. The next question was, how widespread is the feeling of the need of peace among feminist activists in Israel and in Palestine? And Elana?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a complicated question, because I can't give you quantitative statistical analysis of this, but I can point to a couple of phenomenon, sometimes in opposite directions. So there's sort of a common wisdom in Israel that says that since October 7th last year, the entire country has taken 2 steps to the right. You hear that all the time, and that comes up in a lot of everyday exchanges. There's a lot of fear because of the October 7th attack, and there's a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, and it hasn't had a chance even to heal because, first of all, the hostages are still there, and as long as the hostages are not back, Israel is in this like very intense traumatic place. And also because the sense in Israel is that our government is not looking after us, that, our government is really, not acting in the interest of peace and not acting in the interest of safety and security and well-being and just humanity. So there's a lot of insecurity, a lot of fear and insecurity. And we know just from, humanity that the more people are afraid and in terror and traumatized and still in the place of trauma, the more they're going to be in a place of like seeking security, as opposed to like being more courageous and empathetic. Finding empathy when you're at war effectively is hard. It's hard work, and it's in certain way goes against a certain part of human nature. And so we experience that's happening in Israel now too. Israeli society as a whole is really still stuck in October 7th as the sense of being attacked. At the same time, though, there is another phenomenon happening, which is the growth of grassroots peace-seeking movements, especially those led by women. I counted at least 6 or 7 new organizations that have been formed over the past year, led by women, such as Forum 1325, but 1325 is just one. There are organizations called, Mothers Screaming, Parents Screaming for Ceasefire, Mothers Against Violence, Mothers Awake. There's a whole series. And today, actually, right this second, as we speak, there is a Mother's March happening in Tel Aviv. It's called Mothers Raging, calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end of violence. And it's like all the time, this is constantly happening. So my sort of sense from that grassroots is that there is quite a lot of grassroots opposition and grassroots really raging for an end to the war. Every Saturday night, there is a massive protest in Tel Aviv calling for a ceasefire, a return of the hostages, and now also a change in government. The first few months, you know, the movements tried to stay away from quote unquote politics by not calling for a change in government, by making it all more universal, but because that idea that our government is very much responsible for this entire quagmire, since that idea has really grown, the ceasefire movement and the anti-government movement have really coalesced and joined with the hostage movement, returning. So there is a lot of grassroots power right now and insistence on a different way. So that hasn't yet found real expression in anything actual, in like actual events. On the contrary, you know, the war is expanding. War fronts are expanding. It's just growing. And also, because the government is really not paying attention, is very purposefully not paying attention. The Minister of Transport called the hostage families noise. She said she ignores the noise. A woman, actually, which is also a reminder that not all women. Okay, so what I see here, which is I see in a lot of aspects of my life, is two parallel trends at the same time, seemingly going in opposite directions. One trend is sort of a radicalization on the right, and at the same time, a really growing groundswell of women-led feminist resistance and demand for change. And that's happening like right now. Those two movements are happening right now, and they're pressing up against each other in Israel. And I don't know how that's going to end up or what's going to happen next, but it's definitely there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Elana. And Eva?
Thank you, Elena. And I would add to what Ilana just shared, a couple of things. I think it's really important that we understand that this grassroots movement or inclusive grassroots diplomacy that women movement can bring, like bottom up a peace building effort, has to be complemented by top down. And unless it works together to meet in the middle, it doesn't really serve our purpose, including, like focusing on human security over state security, or having joint economic and social initiative, or what we do a lot with peace activation, the narrative shift through storytelling and the media, um, and something that is really important in specifically right now, we're talking about trauma, but we're like in constant re-traumatization. And speaking of feminism solidarity, we haven't had a chance actually, and we've seen it also on LinkedIn, for the feminist solidarity to really stand up for what's happening and speak up, speak truth to power. I think we really need to acknowledge the trauma that is really embedded in every single intervention right now, even within this polarization. A lot of the initiative that in Palestine and Israel are adopting feminist and women-led approach to peace building, but sometimes, and especially it came clear in the event of October 2023, is how much they didn't actually tackle the root causes of the conflict, whether it's some of the organizations that have been working together for a long time, like the Jerusalem Link, the Women Affairs Technical Committee in Palestine, or the Coalition of Women for Peace, or the International Women Commission, or like even the Kayan feminist organization. Like, we have a lot of grassroots initiative, but somehow they reach a glass ceiling where they get stuck. And what is interesting with Form 1325 is that it's promoting women's participation in peace process and the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1325, but it's also goal is really about taking this feminist approach to the next level, designing a woman-led initiative that is building on cross-border dialogue, that is building the promotion of the UN Security Council in the Israeli legislation. We need to be clear that grassroots initiatives that are not reflected in the structure of the state are just initiatives that would die eventually. And for us as women or as feminists to be at the negotiation table or to have a specific impact, we really need to work on multiple levels with multiple stakeholders and in different form. And some of the organizations that I've been working here with them is, for instance, the family forum, that have been really working together, also not only as mother, because often we speak about the mother's pain and we put aside, or at least it's not as portrayed, what's happening also for father. And for me, like, tackling this, specifically this conflict, because of the militarization and how it is covering so many different sections and so many layers, that understanding that we need to have an intersectional approach and bring into this also the justice aspect, and not just like speak about peace building, but what aspect of trauma, of justice, of international feminist solidarity, mental health, and all this intersection between the justice and education and peace is really, really crucial. And I think that part of it is reflected in From 1325 and some of the organizations that are there. And part of it is also represented in the stories that we share in our podcast with some of the women that come and share their initiative, whether it's at the grassroots level or a higher level, such as forgot the name of the initiative, One Land for All, that have really, like, some of these organizations have concrete, specific solution. And that's why I really believe that this conflict is really seemingly unresolvable, but actually we know we have solution. We have actually structures and systems that are ready to be put on place if we just allow this to happen. And for this, we need the power of the majority. That's where the grassroots initiative can help. And then that's where we would need to complement that with a top-down approach of support.
I would add two things. Can I add two things to
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
Eva
Go
said?
ahead.
So first of all, I 1,000% agree with what Eva just said about needing the sandwich, right? We need the sandwich top down and bottom up. It's, it's been like known already for a while that one without the other is faulty. It just doesn't work. And I would add, so I want to add two things. Number one of the organizations that we had on is AllMep, and AllMep is a coalition of organizations working on this, and they have 164 organizations. Okay, when they told us that, it was like, wow, okay, there's 164 organizations collaborating on solutions. So like just what Eva said, the solutions are out there, the people who want to bring them are out there, they're doing the work, but what? So that brings me to the second point, which is that it's not just it's not just top down, but we have to acknowledge something unique maybe not so unique in our situation here, which is that there is a very purposeful attempt to craft language to support the violence. Okay, the Prime Minister of Israel is a master communicator, but he's a master, a demagogue, right? And he uses demagogic language, and he's been doing this for 50 years, for his entire career. He's been crafting language to support a violent, oppressive agenda. And so part of the fight that we have to give back is recrafting language, is taking back language, how we talk about things, how we talk about people, how we talk about the whole story, how we talk about our history, how we talk about the other. There's a language war going on here, which I think whenever you were describing, the sense of like, there's some kind of ceiling to all of this. For me, from where I'm sitting, and maybe it's because of like my anthropology background, language is what interests me. I'm looking at this and I'm looking at the way language is used to shape our ideas. And I'm thinking to myself, we have to go there. We have to be fighting that language war and injecting a whole different type of language about us and them, language and who's we, who's you, who's enemy, what makes somebody deserving to die. There's like a lot of dehumanization. It's language, it's purposeful language of dehumanizing the other. That's what we're living in. I say we as a Jewish American Israeli, okay? So we are living in a rhetorical system in which purposely gets us to see the other as less human. And that is what enables so much of the violence to take place. And so I feel like part of my mission, I'm speaking like personally here, part of my mission is to fight back against the language and to put new language in there, a language of humanity, a language of empathy. Yeah, can you give an example of language that we can start using for change? Yeah, so there's like a lot of language we hear about, immediately calling somebody a terrorist, for example. The media does this. Okay, I'll give you an example from the media. In Israel, and this is Israeli media, that is, fed stuff from government and from, so if there's a violent event, let's say, somebody is killed, okay? So depending on who is killed, it depends on how that person will be labeled. Will they be labeled a human being who has been killed, or will they be labeled a terrorist? Okay, and if they're terrorists, their life doesn't even matter. So for instance, we'll hear a lot of things in Israeli media, like a report that'll say, oh, there was an attack and the attacker was neutralized and there were no injuries. That is how you hear Israeli media often. What that is hiding is that a Palestinian was just killed by Israeli forces. Okay, now, there may be some other story, there might have been a backstory, there might have been something that led up to that, but the very fact of saying that person was a terrorist, and it's not even that that person was killed, that person was neutralized, and there were no deaths, there were no casualties. You hear that all the time in Israeli media. And so we have to fight back against language like that. For example, so, so that's a big piece of it. I think actually in America, there are similar dynamics also, in the Trump era, also, the use of language is dehumanizing, as otherizing. It's language that otherizes and creates barriers of us and them. And that's what I'm trying to, that's what I feel like part of our mission as women who are bringing new perspectives, as women who are bringing new language of, let's say, security. Also, for example, language of security, right? When the Israeli government speaks about security, they're talking about one thing. They're talking about Palestinian terrorists. Okay, that's what language of security is, as opposed to, there are lots of other ideas about what security is. Security also means, housing security. It means food security. It means security to be able to walk down the street. For example, like there are a lot of things. Another example, okay, one more example. There was once a story, also a media story. It was a terrible story about a traffic accident. And in this traffic accident, a couple was killed. Both couples were killed. The couple was killed and they had a little child. That story came and went. A few days later, another story in the news came, which was a couple was killed by a terror attack. Now, it was the same outcome, right? A couple died. The tragedy was the same, of a couple being killed and leaving a child an orphan. The car accident story died in the news. Like it lasted, a few hours in the news cycle, and then it was gone. The terror attack lasted a week. Okay, so I look at that and I say to myself, why? Why is one story considered interesting and the other story is not? And it has to do with a political agenda. It has to do with a political, social agenda of wanting to promote a particular narrative about what are the things that threaten our lives. So as opposed to dealing with traffic safety, road safety, which also is an issue of security, which also is really important to us, which we know as mothers who send our kids out into the world, we are worried about traffic safety as much as we're worried about anything else. But that doesn't get to be a story because it doesn't fit into a particular narrative of how, powers that be want to control how we're thinking. So I'm saying, and also there's an issue of who's to blame, right? Because the traffic safety issue, the government is to blame, but a terrorist issue, it's somebody else outside who we can label, and we could label as the bad guy, and we could say, okay, now let's justify whatever military action we're going to take now. So there's an agenda to the language that's being used. There's an agenda to the things that we see in the media. And so for me, as a feminist, as a woman, as a mother, I'm saying this is part of what I want to be pushing back against. It's not just the violence itself, but it's also an entire system of language that supports the violence, that justifies the violence. And that is a big piece of what I want to be doing in this world now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elana. I think it's very interesting, all the things you are telling us. But I wanted to insist in this question in one single question, which I think has been extremely important. in order to focus on what is happening today. When we speak about peace, when we speak about feminism, we speak about empathy as well. And my question is, how is this feeling of empathy or solidarity of feminists doing regarding what is happening in Gaza? All the killing of, according to official sources, to many sources, 40,000 people in Gaza. How is this being taken in Israel, especially among
Right.
peace activists,
Right.
feminists, etc.?
Right. So I think that's a really important point. That's a vital point. I mean, Eva and I talk about the issue of empathy all the time, about the importance of holding each other's space, of hearing the other person's story, even when it's challenging for you. This is our practice. This is our regular practice of holding space for one another. And I do think that, interestingly, I do think that in the same corners of Israel that are fighting for ceasefire and hostages, there is also a groundswell of empathy for the people of Gaza. For example, the other day I was watching an interview with a hostage mother, okay, a woman who has spent the last year screaming on the streets of Israel to get her son back, her 23-year-old son who's being held hostage in Gaza. She chains herself to the prime minister's house. She burns tires in the street. She's doing her or spending her whole life just dedicated to getting her child back, which anybody can understand, right? If that was any of us, I'm sure, we can understand a person being singularly focused on that goal. And yet the other day, when she was giving an interview about this, and she was talking about the pains, not only about her child, but also about the fact that the government ignores her, that she tried to get into a Likud pre-New Year's event, and they kicked her out. Her own people kicked her out. The government kicked her out and wouldn't listen to her. She's telling the story, and she's saying, what does this say about us? And then she said, and by the way, what are we doing to the Palestinians in Gaza? Right? I don't want to be doing that, she said. I don't want us to be taking those actions. I don't want to see babies being killed in Gaza. No. Okay. So I found that super interesting, because here's a woman who, if she would only be able to see her own particular pain that she's in, I would forgive her, because of course I think we all would, because oh my God, your child's being held hostage. Okay. But even from that place, she was trying to get the rest of us to have empathy for what's going on in Gaza. So that gave me some hope. That gave me some hope that once we are demanding empathy for ourselves, we're able to say, hang on a second, we need to demand empathy for others too, that we want to see others. I think that's the feminist message, actually, for me, feminism. Feminism is about seeing women, right? It's about seeing women who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who have all these kinds of experience, and having empathy for women. Feminism at its core is about having empathy for women. But from that place of empathy for women, we come to a place of empathy for everyone else, where we see everyone else is on the margins. People of color, people of different abilities, people of different social classes, people of different races, people who are suffering for all kinds of oppression and marginalization. From the place of feminism, feminism teaches us to see that, to look at the margins, to look for the people who have been rendered invisible and powerless, and speak out for them. So I feel hopeful about that. I feel hopeful about the women's movements in Israel as being voices for demanding empathy, greater empathy, and seeing beyond yourself, seeing beyond who you've been taught to see only my people. No. See beyond. I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you, Elana. Eva, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add, I hold weekly Zoom calls for Palestinian, Israeli, and international to share about their feeling. I focus very much on feelings, allowing people to express how they feel in regards to what's happening, because I really believe in the power of connection and the power of expressing emotion as energy in motion so that we can release it. And in the last call, the Israel, actually on October 7, the call, Elana, when you were there, and one of the Palestinian activists there, she didn't want to share. She said, it's so heavy, I don't want to share. And we kind of held space in silence to allow her to find her words. And she ended up saying, I don't have any more compassion. That's why I don't want to share. I don't have compassion for the Israeli people. I don't have empathy right now. I don't have it in me. I hear them talk about October 7, and it feels heavy for me when I know what's happening for my family in Gaza and elsewhere. And I think holding that space, allowing her to share her narrative while other Israeli were listening, that's where we can find the place of empathy, even though we thought we didn't have it. And I think it's important, not for the other. It's important for us because I cannot have empathy for Ilana if I don't have empathy for myself and for what's happening for my people and what's happening for my family, because I also have family in Gaza. And it's really important to be present with that pain. And we're not present with the pain. What we're present with is the feeling of anger, frustration, guilt, and shame, and that defeat the purpose. For me, peace activation is really about activating that action inside of me to stop this madness. And if I'm drowning in my emotions of guilt and shame and blame and anger and frustration, I'm paralyzed. I'm not moving. And I think that's where Palestinian and Israeli women can work together towards a shared agenda that is unequivocally asking for ceasefire, asking for end of the occupation, asking for the rehabilitation of what's happening. We spoke about the Alliance of Middle East Peace, which is this network of a peace building organization. I think the peace building organization, including the feminist organization right now in Israel and Palestine, are really in their dark night of the soul. They are reviewing what has happened to lead to October 7. And part of what happened is that we haven't been acknowledging the root causes of the conflict, and we've been treating Palestinian and Israeli as two sides equal that are fighting each other, and not acknowledging the power dynamic and the all other intersectional dynamic. And I think that's important. And it's only with this acknowledgement and holding space for that without denying the existence of the suffering of the other. We're not in a competition of suffering. We're not in a competition who's suffering more. We're in being present with what's happening and dealing with reality as is, and looking at facts in the ground and taking it from there. And I think unless the feminist agenda is focused, whether it's by woman or man, because men are can also be together with us as partner in this feminist agenda, we need to look at the reality and the darkness that we're currently living in the eyes and say, let's work on this together, and not by hiding what we're seeing. And I think a lot of the polarization and the hate speech defeat the purpose, because it moves us out of the field and it moves us out of the focus of like, how can we work together? We actually have a common enemy, and it's the crime minister, as one of our interviewee mentioned it. I don't remember her name, Liran. I really she's like, yeah, she referred to me as the crime minister. What was her name, Ilana?
Was Nava Rosolio.
Nava.
No,
Yeah,
Nava
and she
Rosolio, she's
speaks,
one of the leaders of the protest movement. Yeah.
and the shame. She's doing such great work. I really highly recommend that you listen to the episode and the discussion that we had with her, because it really
We haven't
showed
released it yet, by the way. It's gonna come out in the
it's
coming
gonna
weeks.
come out.
Yeah.
But we've just recorded it last week. But
Yeah.
the reason why I mentioned it is like she gave us as a present the Declaration of Independence of Israel. This was super triggering for me. Yet we were able to hold that discussion and understand that we have two radically different narrative, and it doesn't mean that we need to deny the narrative of the other or the existence of the other or the essence of the other. And a lot of the discussion up until now has been denying the existence of the Palestinian people as the indigenous people on this land. This was the story that was sold to the whole planet. Is like, this is a land without people for people without land. Excuse me, no. There's definitely people on this land, and they're called Palestinians, whether you like it or not. And what happened afterward with the establishment of Israel has led to what happened in October 7, because we have been ignoring the sign up until then. And we're trying to make the narrative as is everything happened in October 7, and we're re-traumatizing the Israeli public and the Jewish public because of what happened in the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not specifically appropriate not s'approprier, I'm mixing all my language now. The Holocaust is not just when we said this is enough and no more after the Holocaust, it wasn't just like this is enough for the Jewish people. It was this is enough for everybody. And right now we're experiencing a genocide on the Palestinian side, and the whole of humanity and the international community is standing by. And this is shameful. I've said it October 2023. I say it still now, a year later. I can't believe like I can say it a year later that we're still just observing what's happening in Gaza. And I was just talking to my cousin that has still family in Gaza, and she's like, nobody can do anything. I just can't believe nobody's doing anything. And people are just dying and running away from one place to another, and people are dying every single day. Every single day. And what we have is more marches, more discussion, more Zoom meeting, more webinar, more protest, but bottom line, nothing is changing. So how is that possible? For me, that's the real question. How is that possible with the amount of support that we have around? And why it is possible? I think it's because of the polarization, because of people choosing side, and rather than focusing on like the fact that people, innocent civilian are dying every single day and nobody's doing anything about it, but rather going on protesting either anti-Semitism or anti-Islam, and it's losing its purpose. Instead of all of us as humanity being focused on stopping the madness, we're fighting each other on who's right and who's wrong. And that defeats the purpose. That's ridiculous. We need all to come together, feminist or not feminist. We need to come together in one field, one agenda, which is ceasefire, end the occupation, and starting rebuilding whatever we can from this rubble, from this horrific year that seem never ending. I'm sorry, I went too long here, but this is really, yeah.
No.
No.
Didn't. You were perfect. I mean, I agree with you, Eva. I think your vision of, coming together to fight this is right. I mean, I feel like, and I've said this many times on our podcast also, is that I want to replace this sort of very tribalistic, who's us and them, like this whole question of who's us and them.
And that there's no choice. Like we have a choice. We actually can choose.
There is a common enemy. I mean, you said the enemy is like, polarization. I think the enemy is radicalism. The enemy is people who are violent, who want to justify violence. And as if we come to, there's the vast majority of people who don't want violence, who really just want a normal life, who want to live, and all of us within our own sectors, if you want to call it that, within each of our sectors, we have radicals, and we have radicals who, live on fear and live on fear mongering and justify violence and use all kinds of rationalizations for that. And so we have to take back that narrative of who's we. Who is we? Who are we working with? Who are we living with? Who are we building society with? And what are our real enemies? Not some abstract enemy, but that the enemy is violence. The enemy is radical violence with its not just physical military violence, but also democratic violence, rights violence. It's the violence that comes from trying to deprive people of their rights, trying to deprive people of their humanity. All violence comes in a lot of forms: emotional violence, financial violence. So, I really connected with one of your last points here, which is about what does it mean for us to come together? Like imagine us coming together to say, what is the enemy here? What are we all trying to fight against? I think that's a vision that I can really get behind. I just would also say about the Holocaust, I agree with you about Holocaust trauma, that for me, the lesson of Holocaust is not, there are two, I've said this before in our podcast, that there are two basic kinds of trauma lessons. Jews carry two different kinds of trauma lessons from the Holocaust. One is, oh my God, look, the whole world hates us. The whole world hates Jews. Anti-Semitism is forever. That's one message. But the other message is, so beware, the world hates Jews. That's one trauma. But the other message is beware, Nazism comes very easily and can be anyone. And we could all very easily become Nazis, and let's not do that. Instead of saying let's not be victims, it's let's not be perpetrators. So those are two very different approaches to how the Jews in general. I'm overgeneralizing, but as effectively, those are the two main types of takeaways that Jews have from our Holocaust trauma. So but the problem now is that like the Holocaust is being invoked all the time, everywhere, and it's really hard. It's such a trigger thing in the Jewish community, and to a certain extent, correctly, right? Because October 7th last year was really beyond, anything. It was, and so I understand what you're saying, Eva, about, you have to go back to see the history and all of that. And for sure, we have to get, understand the history. But at the same time, Jews are really quite stuck in the October 7th event itself. And sometimes it's hard to get past it. And especially because there is this invocation of Holocaust. And once you get the invocation of Holocaust, like that ends conversation. So, part
Yeah,
of, for
but
me,
it's not, yeah, I think
part of my challenge, I
it's
say
forgiving.
this as
Yeah,
like a Jewish Israeli,
yeah.
wanting to bring peace. I say part of my challenge in talking to people is getting past that triggering, that Holocaust trigger stuff, and sort of being present and with what is, not with what was in the Holocaust, but being present right now with what is happening, So it's a challenge. I'm saying I'm
It
saying it as
is
a challenge.
and it is understandable challenge. I mean, we are traumatized, all of us, Israeli,
Yeah.
Palestinian, even the international community, and that's why we're not able to move one step forward. But I think it's really important that we understand that we're bringing the present, the past into the present. We're bringing years, we're dismissing years of occupation. And when we're talking about the creation of the state of Israel on a land that had already indigenous people and ignoring that fact, and talking now about October 7 being a new Holocaust, ignoring the fact that this is the Nakba, our own Holocaust in 1948 is still ongoing, and we
Right.
don't talk about Sabra and Shatila, we don't talk about Deir Yassin. There have been so many massacres throughout the
Right.
years that have been ignored and spoken about, and still we hold sacred the life of a Jewish person, and the life of a Palestinian is like rubble. And so for me, it's just like it's unacceptable. It's
Right. I
unacceptable as
understand.
humans
Right.
to
Right.
say, oh, October 7th happened and it happened. It's actually what happened in October 7th for me is it brought the Nakba to the living room of the Israeli. It brought what
Mm.
happened, what's been happening for us for the past 75 years into the
Mhm.
living room of the Israeli that wanted to feel like the only democracy in the Middle East and continuing life as usual, while just next door, an hour away, there's a whole population that is under occupation and being killed daily. That's what
Right.
happened in October 7. And
Right.
that's what people do not understand when they say, oh, Palestinians are seeking revenge and vengeance, and they're like radical and like the Hamas was created by Israel.
Yeah,
The
that's
Hamas was
true.
created by Israel as an alternative to the moderate Palestinian Authority. And then it was fed by Israel to keep Gaza contained. Like we need to look into history, we need to look into context and not just like get stuck into side. That's why I say like I'm not against the Israeli, I'm not against the Jewish
Mm.
people. On the
Mm.
contrary, I'm happy to collaborate and speak, but I want to speak truth to power. I
Mhm.
want to have collaboration with people that are willing to see truth in their face, whether they're triggered or not. That's why it's peace
Mm.
activation, because I do want to activate and trigger people. Because if you're triggered, it means that you're not disconnected from your emotion. And what's happening right now is we're disconnecting from our emotion and from the horror that are happening every single minute in
Right.
Gaza and in the
Right.
West Bank and in Tulkarem and in Nablus and in Jenin, but we don't refer to it because we don't know. What we know is like we call it the West Bank, as it's like it's somewhere elusive. West Bank. No, the West Bank has several cities that are being shelled every single day, and we need to be aware of that.
Right. So, I really understand what you're saying, and I really agree with what you're saying. I do think that it's hard. October 7th made that process harder because as long as Israelis are being attacked, and also like Israelis are also under attack, in the north, rockets and stuff, there's no moment of peace for Israelis either. So there's no moment when Israelis can like breathe and say, oh, okay, let's, think about this calmly. And I think, Netanyahu does this on purpose. It's good for him, the more, that's why that's why he created Hamas, because Hamas is good for Bibi, because the more Israelis are terrified and the more Israelis are under attack, the less there is that kind of real questioning and real, asking questions and asking about all of that language of indoctrination. I say this as someone, I grew up in religious Zionism, and so I grew up in a lot of that indoctrination. And so all the things that you're saying need to happen about getting Israelis to stop thinking just about, oh, the rockets are flying over our head, we have to think about the history. All that process that has to happen requires undoing a lot of indoctrination, which gets back to what I was saying before about language. There's a lot of unpacking of language that has to take place. And I say that as someone who spends a lot of my time unpacking my own history and my own education and things like that. It's not easy and it's not simple, and it's particularly hard to do it when we're still in the shadow of hostages and October 7th and rockets and missiles from Yemen and all the other things. It's really hard to go through that process that you're describing. That's what I'm saying. October 7th made it harder. But you're 100% right that this is what has to happen, is that we have to undo all of that language of indoctrination and learn to humanize the other and ask questions about history and ask questions about things that we were taught to be true that really aren't. That's a difficult process, and we need some kind of context for that to be able to happen. And it's really hard. I mean, that's why I'm doing this work. Like, I'm doing this work to try to do that. I'm just saying that it's just hard. Yeah. But
I
thank you.
really
And
think
also
this
thank
is
you, Eva.
extremely interesting, this discussion, but I would like to come to the last point because we are already approaching the end of the first hour. And what I wanted to, this discussion, there has been a lot about the causes and the polarization, the damages to both sides, etc. And my question would be, what are your prospects of peace? How do you see a concrete prospects, concrete plans for peace, concrete proposals for peace? And that's one of the questions. And the other one is, what are the best ways for our audience to support your work? So those are the two final questions I would like you to discuss.
I think we have, if I may, I
Yes.
don't want to discuss that because we have a whole podcast on on several of these prospects. That's why I say it's unnecessarily complicated. We have there's several proposals on how concretely we can move beyond, even beyond the two-state solution. There's a proposal for confederation. There's a proposal for one land to all. There's a proposal there's several proposals. The proposals are not the issue. I think the issue is really the existential question of, like, do the Jewish people have legitimacy to live on the land of Palestine? And that's the real question. When we tackled one whole piece in 2016, when I started with my colleague Dalit Eliyahu, we tackled the psychological effect of the conflict, because up until now, and that's what we're dealing with right now. The reason why I'm here in Israel is I was doing trauma informed approach in peace building for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And I think part of the issue up until now is that we didn't deal that it's an existential question. That's why there's this bipolarization. Israel was created to provide safety for the Jewish people. And October 7th brought it to the living room that there's no security without freedom. There's no security without peace. You cannot have security when you're occupying a whole population next door and you're blaming them to be terrorists every time that they seek their freedom. And so I think that we have solution. There's prospect for peace. There's one land for all. There's different, we can put, like, if you go to our episode, we've discussed this at length in several of these episodes. So I think I will, Elana, if you want to add more, but I think that we covered this. And that's what we need to know, that there are options. Are we willing to tackle these options? That's the real question. And I know that I read in the chat, one person said, what do you really mean by referring to this conflict unnecessarily complicated? I'm referring to it unnecessarily complicated because it's seemingly as if Palestinian and Israeli are fighting together on an equal basis. We used to live in peace. Palestinian and Jewish people before 1948 were living in peace under the British mandate. And then it happened, and manipulation of international business, I would call, made it so that the creation of Israel meant the annihilation of the Palestinian state. for various reasons, for the war declared by the Arab that they lost, for the fact that the Palestinian left their home, but they didn't leave their home like this, you know? It's like several massacre and genocidal attack happened to lead to where we are right now. And that's why I say it's like we bring the past on the Holocaust to the present, but we're refusing part of this story is pushed to the side. There's an excellent book actually called Stranger in My Own Land by Fida Jirias that is narrating the whole process of this. The thick book that I highly recommend to read. But I think it's really, we really need to be aware of it's not Palestinian against Israeli. This is not an equal balance conflict. And that's what we've been trying to do up until now, is giving the same amount of time and energy and resources for Israeli and Palestinian as if we're dealing with a normal conflict. It's not.
So, again, we have a policy, a sort of policy in our conversations about connect before you correct, right? The idea is that we don't get into arguments about, facts and history per se, but the idea is really to try to hear the other's narrative. But I do think that it's a little unfair to say that in 1948, the entire goal of the Jewish people was to annihilate the Palestinians. I mean, I'm not saying that, Jews
Ben
didn't.
Morris,
What?
there's several books by Jewish historians that said that this was the strategy that is still continuing to date.
I think that saying that the goal is the annihilation of the entire Palestinian people is possibly a little extreme. I don't know that I don't know that I could, I don't know, right? I don't think that that's fair. I think that, I'm not saying that Israel didn't do a lot of things in 1947, and there were a lot of issues, even in Jaffa, the story of Jaffa and how so many families had to leave, and, there were a lot of terrible stories. There are many, many, many terrible stories. But I do think that sort of that grandiose statement of like Israel was established to annihilate the Palestinian people, I think is not.
If you want to justify land without people for people without land, you needed to
No, I
destroy the
understand,
people that
right?
you know.
I'm not,
And
I
it's okay for
understand.
you
I
to
grew up with that.
disagree,
No,
Elana.
see,
Yeah,
Eva,
I know.
I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying because I totally grew up with that statement, right? I'm not denying that
Yeah.
I'm really not denying that at all. And I'm not trying to say that Israel didn't do some really terrible things. I'm saying that statement, Israel was established to annihilate the Palestinian people, feels extreme to me, and it feels inaccurate. And
yeah,
also because there
that's okay.
wasn't actually a Palestinian state before then. It's not that before 1948.
Palestinian people, not Palestinian state.
Right. So I'm saying, but you said like, oh, Israel came to annihilate the state, but there was no Palestinian state. 1948 was supposed to be the establishment of an Israel and a Palestine next to each other. And I think that there were a lot of Jews back then. There were a lot of Jews in 1948
Yeah.
who would have been happy with that, who would have been okay with two states, a Palestine and an Israel. And actually, it was the Palestinians who rejected that. That was the offer for the UN. So it was the Palestinians who rejected that. So that's why I think that it's a little bit unfair because I think that Israel, when the Jews were given that offer in 1948, here's a two-state solution. It was the original two-state solution, right? Jews accepted it and Palestinians didn't. So to come from there to say, you see, Israel was established for the annihilation of the Palestinian people is unfair to that moment in history when there was an opportunity to have two states. Again, I really don't want to get into a discussion about the history of it. I'm just saying that it's hard for me to hear that statement, Israel was established for the sole purpose of annihilating the Palestinian people. I think that's too extreme for me. And again, I'm not saying to justify any of Israel's actions or any Jewish actions. I'm saying that it's not exactly it for me. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So I just want to put that out there.
That's okay.
And also remember that 1948 was 3 years after the Holocaust. 6 million Jews had died. And it's like, it's hard to even put yourself in that place of what it meant to be Jewish in 1948. So anyway, but I'm not saying that to justify anything that Israel has done. And anyway, okay.
But I want to come back to as a question is, what can the audience, the public do to help the efforts you are trying to do regarding peace efforts, etc.?
Support our podcast. Share our podcast, share our work, subscribe to our Substack, subscribe to Eva's Substack, subscribe to my Substack, share, engage, really, I mean, I know it sounds so like trite, but really that's the whole thing here, is to share the conversation, to share the dialogue, to share the empathy, to share the vision of a different future, to share the different, to share the idea that this could be different.
Yeah. And also to share the fact that, I mean, as you can see, Ilana and I are not agreeing on everything, and it's still okay. We can agree to disagree. And I think that's really key. For me, what I can ask from people that are stuck in their position is like really to come into like, what's our interest together, what are our needs together. And it might be different on the surface, but it's not actually once we delve deeper. And so for me, it's really how the way people can support us is of course what Eliana mentioned, but also to activate peace inside of them. And when they're triggered by anything anybody say, is to really look in the mirror and find that peace inside so that we can activate peace outside. Ilana and I, or any other person, we don't need to agree on every single sentence, but we do agree that we can still work together towards a just and possible future for everybody. And for it to be non-violent. I think this is really important to highlight that we can live in peace together, acknowledging each other's existential need for for living. The Palestinian want peace as much as the Israeli want peace. Palestinian want freedom. They need justice. They need rehabilitation. We're so resilient, and I think we became so comfortable in the conflict, and that needs to change. So what we can do to support this effort is to stop being comfortable in the conflict, to start really activating and working together beyond the difference and finding the common ground that can really bring us together.
Good. Thank you very much, Eva. And now we have some time for more questions from the public. You have already answered some regarding, I think, Annika Concel's question. And I would like Susan or Alice to help us with reading these questions, that
Yeah,
the
I
ones
just
that
saw
have
one of,
not been answered. Yes, the comments and
sorry.
questions that have not
Yeah,
been
I just
answered
saw one
yet.
of the comment from Jessica saying, I want to know how you both are going to debrief after. Well, we're gonna debrief just like as we speak here. Like this, the way you see us interact here is exactly the same as we interact on, online and offline. We often disagree, and we often then come to a conclusion that it's okay to disagree, and this is my point of view, and this is hers. And what we wanna keep each other is with respect and in a field beyond right or wrong. So I don't make Elana wrong for what she believes or what she says. Just like as you see, she doesn't make me wrong. She disagree, but she doesn't say you're wrong. Or at least I'm not hearing it as you're saying you're wrong. Like it's not completely true. And it might be true. Maybe in my passion, I just go to the extreme and it's okay. And then I can, like when I come down and center, I'm like, okay, this is not completely true. It's true, but like I'm carried away because the whole day I just spent with my family in Gaza, speaking, etc. And I'm just like fired up with what's happening and frustrated of the fact that nothing is happening. It's still continuing. So for me, it's
And I
also okay
understand
to
that, by the
acknowledge.
way.
Yeah,
I really
I know.
appreciate your frustration. I understand why you're frustrated, and I understand.
And I think it's okay to be frustrated and still not be violent and still not be polarized. And I think one of the key things I want to specifically ask people to do is like, please don't polarize. Please don't choose side. Choose the side of the field. Choose the side of peace. Let's work together to change the situation rather than blame each other of like, oh, you're pro-Palestinian or you pro-Israeli and you have to choose a side. And because what it does, it moves us away from the core issue, and then people are fighting each other rather than working towards a solution. We're not working together towards a solution. We're fighting each other. And in the meantime, the forces of evil, if we want to call them, or the forces of darkness are winning. And yeah, it
Right,
defeats the purpose.
right, right.
I would like to pass your attention to one of the comments I can read here. I don't know if you have time. You have had time to read it. Thanks for this discussion and your work. I have a question about the conditions needed for peace and justice processes. I have heard many people say in the past, and have been thinking myself, that regular Israelis will not fight or push for peace or for a solution as long as the conflict is not really felt for them in their everyday life. But now that the conflict is felt and Israelis are traumatized and stuck on October 7th, you say that there is no moment to breathe and therefore a work towards peace cannot start. This seems contradictory to me. What do you think about this?
So as I said, I think you're right, it's contradictory. And that's what I was saying before, is that there are parallel processes happening in different directions. And I see that very clearly. I see two very contradictory processes happening at the same time. I see movement towards the two steps to the right thing, where some Israelis can't even engage, can't even think, just like Eva said that she spoke to, that someone had said, I'm so in Gaza and what's going on in Gaza that I can't hear Israelis. I don't want to hear what they're going through. So Israelis are thinking, there are many Israelis who have the same experience. You know, I have a friend up north who's living all the time with rocket fire from Hezbollah. She is stuck in nonstop rocket fire from Hezbollah. So any kind of conversation about, you know, peace or Hamas or Palestinians, she doesn't have room in her head for it. So that's definitely happening. And also there are a lot of people who experienced October 7th. There are tens of thousands of people, of Israelis who've been displaced from October 7th, who have, you know, a woman we interviewed also last week, she's out of her home. She doesn't know when she's going to get back to her home. Some of her kids have moved out. She lost friends who have been killed. She has friends who have been taken hostage. She's so in October 7th. You know, I was chatting with her today. I didn't even tell you, Eva, but I was chatting with her today, and it's too hard for her to engage. She was a peace activist for her whole life. She's 80 years old, and she was a peace activist for her whole life. But today, when we asked her about, you know, what's happening in Gaza, she really couldn't engage. And she told me today she couldn't even really think about it. She can't, she's not able to even go there. So that there's definitely that phenomenon happening of people who are totally stuck in the trauma and in their own dealing with everyday existence, that they cannot engage with the issue of peace. At the same time, there is a strong and growing groundswell of people who are engaging and people who are asking questions, even from the place of the trauma. Like the example that I gave about the mother, who, even though she's a mother of a hostage, you know, she's spending her whole life on the hostages. From that place, she's finding empathy for Palestinians, okay, which is, you know, which is both to a certain extent maybe unusual, or maybe not, or maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe it's the case is that once we're demanding empathy, we start to expand that part of empathy to others. Maybe it opens up our eyes. I mean, just another example, okay? When the parents of Hirsch Palin Goldberg, who was a hostage who was killed, you know, about a month and a half ago, they spoke at the Democratic National Convention in America, and their purpose there was to speak about the hostages. But when they were talking about the hostages, they also said, and we have to stop with all the killing of innocent people in Gaza. They said it there. And again, from that place of trying to ask for compassion for their son, they were the only ones there to also mention the people of Gaza. So again, it was the same thing of saying, like, from my place of asking for compassion for myself, my mind is opening and my heart is opening to asking for compassion for others. So that phenomenon also exists. And again, I'm saying that they coexist, right? There's, to a certain extent, two parallel processes. But you know, if you ever see what's going on Saturday nights in Tel Aviv, the anguish is just massive. It's this, I mean, a few weeks ago, there was something like 700,000 people there. They thought it is considered the largest protest that ever took place in Israel's history. 700,000 people calling for an end to the war, you know, calling for an end to all of it. And so that's also happening. So it is contradictory. You're right, it is contradictory. I would say it's sort of coexisting, and it's like this big mush. It's a big
It's a
mush
dilemma.
thing.
It's you know, I think it's the logical mind that wants this to be black and white, and it's not. Of course, it's contradictory because this is the paradox. This is really the paradox of life, of holding two truths in one heart. I mean, what's happening right now to the Israeli society, I had a lot of compassion when we spoke with that woman in her home, but a lot of compassion for her. It broke my heart. But it broke my heart because my heart is already broken for my Palestinian people. And so if I'm disconnecting from my heartbreak for my tribe, for myself, for my family, I have still space inside of me to feel compassion for the other. But that comes from compassionate self-forgiveness. And I think that's why it's important to understand that, or at least for me, the perspective is like some people don't have that in them, and that's okay. We cannot oblige them. We can have compassion for them and try to find the people that do have space for two truth in one heart. And I think that's where, in a way, that's my request for support from the people that are able outside of Israel and Palestine that are able to hold this rather than polarize and fight and pollute the field. Help us to come together into a field of compassionate self-forgiveness, a field of loving acceptance, radical acceptance of our differences. And how can we build peace together, piece by piece? And I often say we need to drop the drama to heal the trauma. We are swimming in drama land. We are in a Truman Show in Israel where there's such a disconnect from the feeling and from what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank that we're only focusing on what happened on October 7 and the disaster and the atrocity and the horrific reality that happened. And I have compassion for that. And at the same time, I'm like, okay, yes. And can we move forward together? Can we ask for ceasefire together? Can we end the occupation together? Can we build a common future that is built on security, freedom, and justice for all together? Because we can. Because our enemy is the same. We're not fighting each other. We're fighting one enemy. And once we understand, then the solution, and I think that's the solution that we can long for, and that's in response to one of the comments in the chat, that's the solution that we can long for, and we can work together to have it manifested.
You had also some questions and answers here from the public. It just disappeared one regarding people working for this and doing a lot of things. I think Katarina took away her question.
I think
That
it's here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just typed a little answer to that. Some groups are doing practical acts. And
Yes.
so, for example, I volunteer with Road to Recovery. We interviewed someone from Road to Recovery, Yael Treidel,
Yeah.
and we talked a
Amazing.
lot about that. So yeah, and I do a whole bunch of other kinds of volunteering as well. Yeah.
There's several amazing organizations at the grassroots level working together, Palestinian and Israeli. Like there's the organization Roots, there's the organization the Parent Circle Forum, there's
Standing together, right?
yeah,
What
there's
else? Yeah, I go to a lot of
we
standing
can
together
give a
events.
whole list. We can give a
Mhm.
list of this organization.
Yes. She wrote standing together, rabbis for human
Exactly,
rights,
standing
etc.
together, combatant for peace. There's several organizations that are doing amazing joint work with a lot of compassion to each other. But the compassion can only be here if we speak truth to power, not if we pretend that what's happening in Gaza is not happening, or that it's the fault of the Palestinian, or that it's justified Israel's right for self-defense. Like we need to stop this bullshit and see reality as it is.
And the other question is regarding militarism. That neither of you mentioned that one of the problems is militaries and militarist mindsets as obstacles to peace. What is your thinking on militarism?
I think we kind of alluded to it a couple of times, like when I was talking about the dehumanization of the other and justification for violence. I mean, that's militaristic thinking. When I was talking about the radicals in the, who want to justify violence, that's militarism. When I was talking about women coming in with new definitions of security, what security
Human
means,
security, yeah.
that it's very different. That part of women's roles, part of the reason we need women around the table is because of our different approaches to problem solving. That, the way things have been done until now is that the only answer is a militaristic answer, right? So part of what we want, in especially UN Security Council Resolution 1325, a big piece of this is alternatives to militaristic thinking, alternatives to violence, alternatives to the very singular, dehumanizing way of thinking. All these things are connected. I didn't use the term militarism, but that was like implied in a lot of, I think, what we were talking about.
I mean, we live in a very, very militarized society. You know,
Yeah.
you go to a coffee here and you have randomly a man or a woman coming in with like an M16 in civilian, and you're like, whoa, I'm here drinking coffee, and there's like this soldier in civilian, but with an M16 that is sitting just next to me, and it's enough to have like one bad move, or if he's traumatized or triggered, that he can like shoot everybody.
Oh
And
my
that's
God,
part of
Eva, you
what
haven't
happened.
been to the parks. You
I
have
know.
in the parks. I mean,
Yeah,
it drives me crazy. It
it's
absolutely drives me crazy. You see all
and
these
it's normalized. Like militarism and
normalized. I
violence is
know.
not. We live in a very normalized, violent culture,
Yeah.
and it's justified. All this patriarchy, you know, it's
Yeah.
justified by we need this for our security to defend ourselves, and we don't. Again, we
Right.
don't.
Right. Right. I have this argument with people all the time. You know, people like, you know, when you see a guy holding a gun and he's picking up his 2-year-olds in the park, and I'm like, nah, don't bring your gun to the park, and go put it in a safe somewhere when you're with your kid. Like, oh, it drives me. It's really, yes. Sorry, yes. This is like a, yes.
It's a major, I mean, it's a major, don't say sorry. It's a major issue here. I mean,
Yeah.
also some of the acts of violence happen because these guns are running freely everywhere.
And also, by the way, Ben Gvir, who's, you know, one of the most, if the not the most militaristic, violent, racist people in our country, who's now the Minister of Police, you know, he has one of the first things he did when he came into power was to make it easier for abusive husbands to get guns.
Yeah, yeah,
Until then, there were all these women's groups who were really trying to limit handgun use and handgun ownership and make it harder and all of that. And all those protections had been in place until Ben Gvir came into power. And like one of the first things he did was to, you know, protect abusive men, protect violent abusive men. And, you know, these things are connected.
yeah.
Patriarchy and militarism, they're all connected, totally connected. So there's that too. Mhm. Sorry to,
Okay, we have still 8 minutes more. I don't know if from the public anybody else wants to formulate a question.
well, Jessica
There,
asked a question before where she said, she said, what if Elana asked Eva, what do you need to hear from me right now for real
hmm,
reconciliation?
hmm.
Eva, what do you need to hear from me right now for real reconciliation?
I think what comes forward is that as Palestinian we're here, that we existed,
Mm.
and that we have the right to live in peace, freedom in our own land, and that we welcomed a lot of the refugee that came from the Holocaust. We opened the door, we as Palestinian, we welcomed you, and then we got betrayed by you, betrayed by the British, betrayed by the Arab countries. And I, on a personal level, and I think as a collective trauma, Palestinians feel betrayed, and that's what is happening right now as well. And so I feel I need an apology and an acknowledgement that we've been betrayed. Our generosity of heart and generosity of welcoming people into our homes got taken away for granted and rejected as if we are the terrorist and we did something wrong, and we didn't. Even if we didn't acknowledge the state of Israel when the UN took its decision and we rejected the plan, it's as if like, imagine someone come to your home and say, oh, well, you didn't declare that this is your home. We're going to divide it in half and give it to these people that come from somewhere else because they're refugees. Would you accept? And then, oh, by the way, we're taking the rest of what is left.
So Eva, I can't necessarily speak for the entire Jewish people, but I can speak for me as a Jewish American Israeli who grew up in all the language of Zionism and all of this. And I want to say to you, Eva, my beautiful Eva, who I love as a person, as a human being, deeply love you. I want to say, Eva, I'm sorry. I am really sorry for the pain that my people have caused your people. I'm sorry for all the dehumanizing language. I'm sorry that for all the things that I was brought up on, all those ideas that Palestinians aren't real people and they don't really have a culture and they don't belong here and they're not even here. All of those things you said are true. I grew up on all of it. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for all of that. I'm sorry for my participation in it. I'm sorry it took me so long to unpack it myself. And I really deeply hope and pray that there will come a day when your people and my people can see each other as human beings. We can just be, wherever it is that we need to be, wherever it is that we want to be, whatever it is that we want to call home, that we respect each other's history, that we respect each other's need for home, that we respect each other's need for freedom, for justice, for security, for history, for culture, for whatever it is that human beings need. I pray that you and I will be just neighbors and friends without having to carry all this baggage, without having to be in fear of all of this violence. And that's my prayer. And I'm just sending you, Eva, from my heart to your heart, human to human, just so much love and gratitude for this conversation, gratitude for being here, gratitude for being willing to engage with me. It's not easy, and just being present. So thank you.
Thank you, Elana. I fully receive it. Thank you.
We have now a very, very long comment. We don't have time to read, but the commentary, she says that it's not a question, it's a long comment, and if you read it to the end, you will understand that it's a message of hope. And then the final one, how do you see the seemingly complicated conflict resolved by the cooperation of two sides, Israel and Palestinian, if there is one more big player in this conflict whose agenda is to eliminate one of the sides altogether? I'm speaking of Iran. Thank you.
So we actually had a podcast about this. We had a podcast from a professor whose entire life's work is this. And she's working with strategic thinkers and politicians and diplomats and legal experts to try to create what she calls the regional alliance. It's this whole idea that if moderates in all the countries got together and stood up against Iran, then Iran would basically lose its power. It's a theory. There are solutions. There are solutions. You know, I don't think that Iran could be the excuse for not pursuing peace. I think that that's what Bibi Netanyahu wants us to. Every time somebody challenges Bibi with, what about Gaza? What about peace? What about anything? What about, the healthcare system? He always says, oh, but Iran. That's like his thing. It's his knee-jerk response. And then he says Iran, and then everybody's like, oh, Iran. And that's the end of the conversation. Like it's a total trigger. It's a Pavlovian thing. Mention Iran and that like eliminates all other conversations. And I would like us to stop doing that. That's not to say that, the Iran thing isn't real. I was sitting here in my house when 400 ballistic missiles from Iran came our way. So I know that that's real. But I think that it's a little bit of a social construct also. It's a little bit of like how it's perceived. And I don't want to use Iran as an excuse not to do the right thing and everything else.
Okay. Somebody is asking about the pods, and this person came in quite late, so that person cannot read the pod. So, Susan, can you just publish what we had in the beginning again so that everybody can see the
have
links of the
reposted.
pods?
I have
Okay,
reposted all
good.
of the
Thank
links.
you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay,
so
thank you.
much.
And feel
Okay.
free to reach out to me. I'm saying to myself, if you want to chat, I'm happy to chat with anybody who's here, happy to continue the conversation. And yeah.
That's very we are very thankful to both of you, Elena and Eva, and I think this has been a very, very useful conversation, not only interesting, but extremely useful, because we have understood much more what is happening behind the content. I would say the news which we receive every day from different mass media. We don't hear this kind of perspectives. We don't hear what is happening with these groups that are really trying to do something to end the conflict. We don't hear much about feminist or peace initiatives at all. We just hear about war and about suffering and about
Because that's the
victims.
business.
Yes,
That's the business
exactly.
of the
So
media.
these,
Yeah.
that's why this conversation has been so incredibly useful, interesting, useful, and I think that we have all learned a lot about this conflict from your perspectives. We thank you. We have, and we hope that we continue the conversation some other time. We have your pods, your links, and our audience has also got them. So I would like to invite everybody to continue this conversation with our panelists afterwards in an informal way, through their pods, through their communication channels. And I really hope that the situation doesn't get worse, even if I suspect it will get worse. But there is hope at the end of the tunnel, and that's on these thoughts. We will close this webinar, and we will thank you very much again for having come to us.
Thank you,
and giving us this.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ilana. Thank you for all the comments and questions and the great facilitation and holding such a beautiful space. Thank you, Ilana. See you on the other side.
Thank
for
you,
debrief.
Ilana, and thank you, Eva.
Debrief.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ciao. Bye-bye.